everybody, this is Tim and welcome to the show. You know, San Francisco and the surrounding areas here have probably defined the psychedelic era of garage rock better than anywhere else I can think of in the world. And many of the bands featured here today were of the one-hit wonder variety that were rescued from obscurity when Lenny Kaye's Nuggets album was released in the 70s. So for today's show, we're going to start at one end of the most rock and roll famous street in San Francisco and visit some rock essential locations as we work our way up Haight Street all the way to Golden Gate Park and hopefully Hippie Hill. So let's get started. This here is Pipe Dreams, and it's the oldest continuously operating head shop here on Haight Street, and I think it would be the perfect place to introduce our first band. Let's check it out. When it comes to what might be the signature song of the garage rock psychedelic movement, I think there's a good argument for it being 1966's Psychotic Reaction by a San Jose band called the Count Five. And this fuzz-laden noise fest would make it all the way up to number 5 on the charts. As their popularity skyrocketed, they found themselves doing gigs with a fledgling Los Angeles band whose cocky lead singer told them, the only difference between you and us is you have a hit single. And of course, I'm talking about the Doors. And by the way, I think one of the more interesting things about this band is the fact that they wore Count Dracula-style capes when they performed. By 1968, the band was breaking up, and they were all of 19 years old. And as Faber College's Dean Wormer was fond of saying, you're all eligible for military service. And the Vietnam War broke them up and drafted them, much the same they did to many of the bands at the time. In 1971, music journalist Lester Bangs wrote a famous essay called Psychotic Reaction and Carburetor Dung about a string of legendary albums the Count Five had released after Psychotic Reaction. It was all total fantasy, but to my knowledge, it was the first time anyone had used punk to reference a genre of music, and that genre would go on to absolutely change the face of rock and roll. One-hit wonders, yes, but a pretty big damn hit. Psychotic Reaction. One of the most important figures in all of rock and roll was right here from the Bay Area, and I'm talking about the late, great Sly Stone, or the former Sylvester Stewart, as he was known back then. He made some huge contributions to the garage rock movement in the mid-60s. There are 3 groups in particular that he was involved with, and the first would be one of the most sublime groups ever to come out of San Francisco. They were called the Beau Brummels. The Beau Brummels formed in San Francisco's North Beach when a young neighborhood singer named Sal Valentino needed a backing band and called his childhood friend, guitarist and songwriter Ron Elliott. Shortly thereafter, a couple of local DJs signed them to their Autumn Records and assigned another local DJ, the aforementioned Sly Stone, to produce them. Their first single, Laugh Laugh, went to number 15 on the charts, making them the very first 60s San Francisco band to do so. And then they followed it up with what I consider to be one of the really great songs of the era, Just a Little. And with their zombie-style harmonies and tremolo guitar, it still really gets to me. They released a couple more albums, but none had the audacity of that first one. And by the way, this is the Pork Store Cafe, and it's been a breakfast institution here on the Haight since 1916. And despite a few hiccups, it's been operating continuously as the Pork Store Cafe since 1979. In 1965, Sly Stone would have an impact on another San Francisco band called the Mojo Men. And as a matter of fact, for a brief time, Sly actually fronted them, and they were called Sly and the Mojo Men. But the band's most memorable song was the Stephen Stills pen single, Sit Down, I Think I Love You, which was released in 1967. And just in case you were wondering, the Buffalo Springfield version of the song is vastly superior to the Mojo Men's somewhat flaccid rendition of it. But the Mojo Men's lasting influence on rock and roll would come almost 20 years later when guitarist Paul Curcio would produce another Bay Area band's breakout album, Kill 'Em All by Metallica. This is the corner of Haight Street and Ashbury, And I don't think there's much I can add to this location that you don't already know. The epicenter, as it were, was right here. The third group that Sly Stone had a hand in producing was called the Great Society, and they were a quintet that featured drummer Jerry Slick's very alluring wife Grace on vocals. They existed briefly from 65 to 66, and they only released one single, a folk psychedelic song called Someone to Love, but it was a precursor to everything that would later come for Grace Slick. One of the bands that the Great Society shared bills with often was the Jefferson Airplane, who were more steeped in the psychedelia sound. But when the Jefferson Airplane lost their singer, the soon-to-be divorced Grace Slick was ready to jump right in. And Grace and the Jefferson Airplane changed the name to Someone to Love to Somebody to Love, and she also took with her a Great Society song, a song she had written called White Rabbit, and that, as they say, is that, the Great Society. Just a couple of storefronts up, and this shop was the former location of Masonic, and in the late 60s it was run by fashion designer Peggy Caserta, who among other things gave birth to the Levi bell-bottom jean when she sewed up a pair for her friend Janis Joplin right here. Anyway, the Bay Area band that might be the very epitome of garage rock psychedelia is the Chocolate Watch Band. Their name basically says it all. And not unlike Southern California band The Seeds, they were the precursors by a decade of a lot of what happened in punk rock. In my opinion, the group they most resembled was the Yardbirds, and in 1966 they started making waves on the San Francisco music scene, so much so that they appeared in the teen exploitation film Ride on the Sunset Strip, as well as a movie called The Love-In, and they became synonymous with the emerging psychedelic sound. Then in '67 they released their debut album, No Way Out, which still stands today as an American garage rock psychedelic masterpiece. They recorded one more album before breaking up, but thanks to the cult status of Ride on the Sunset Strip and Nuggets, they've been able to regroup and reform and can still be heard to this day on Little Steven's Underground Garage. Melts in your head, not in your hand. The Chocolate Watch Band. One of the groups that comes up again and again in 60s San Francisco rock lore is the Charlatans. They're legendary but commercially obscure, and were probably the first band to really embrace the LSD parties that they were playing alongside San Francisco stalwarts like the Grateful Dead and Jefferson Airplane. They were also one of the first bands to advertise using what would become San Francisco poster art. They were signed by Kama Sutra Records, which, by the way, is the same label the Lovin' Spoonful was on, and had several recording sessions between 1965 and their demise in '69, but the album was never released. Subsequently, they've put out CDs of those sessions, including the song How Can I Miss You When You Won't Go Away by former member Dan Hicks, who would eventually go on to be Dan Hicks and his Hot Licks. And by the way, in 1967's Summer of Love, this fine establishment was founded in response to an ever-growing demand, and it is the Haight Ashbury Free Clinic. It was permanently closed in 2019, and if only walls could talk, right? And almost but never was one of the quintessential San Francisco rock bands with what I feel is the greatest name of their time, the Charlatans. On the exact opposite side of that coin would be this next group, the band with the absolute worst name, whose members would eventually make the biggest commercial impact, the Golliwogs. In 1964, after watching a public television documentary about a small jazz label in San Francisco called Fantasy, a young East Bay songwriter named John Fogerty knocked on their door and gave them his demo. He had made it with his brother Tom, bassist Stu Cook, and drummer Doug Clifford, who at the time were calling themselves the Blue Velvets. The long and short of it was that they were signed, but it wasn't until they saw the labeling on their first single, Little Girl Does Your Mama Know, that they found out the name bestowed upon them by the Tone Deaf record company, and needless to say, they detested it. Nevertheless, over the next 3 years, the Golliwogs managed to release 21 singles until the ownership of the record company changed hands in 1967, and they were able to change their hated name to Creedence Clearwater Revival. and the rest, as they say, is history. The Golliwogs. So this storefront here was once known as the Pacific Ocean Trading Company, and it was owned and operated by Stanley Mouse, who was a famous psychedelic poster maker who was responsible for the Grateful Dead Bertha logo. And although it was billed as a poster store, it was more of a neighborhood hangout for musicians, including the likes of Janis Joplin, the Charlatans, and of course the Grateful Dead. Another great psychedelic garage band that formed in 1964 was the Syndicate of Sound, and they got their start when they won a Bay Area Battle of the Bands concert against 100 other groups. The prize being a recording contract with Delphi Records, where they released a single that got little more than local airplay. By 1966, the band had latched on to the emerging psychedelic sound coming up here in San Francisco, and they released their first original single, Hey Little Girl, and it made it into the top 10. Hey Little Girl is one of those songs that has been covered by dozens of bands and was another from the 60s San Francisco scene that was championed by punk bands like the Dead Boys and Divinyls, and even country artist Dwight Yoakam did a version of it. A band with a very solid one-hit wonder pedigree, Syndicate of Sound. I think the San Francisco band that most served to bridge the gap between the 60s and 70s garage rock sound was the Flamin Groovies. And they started out in 1965 and were heavily influenced by the Rolling Stones, but it wasn't until '68 that they released their self-produced EP, Sneakers. Throughout the late 60s and early 70s, they continued to produce great albums. Foremost among them was Teenage Head, which just shimmered with a sound that would eventually become known as power pop. As you can see, this is a San Francisco outlet for probably the most prominent California vinyl record store chain left, Amoeba Records. It's huge inside and worth at least an hour of anybody's time. Still a pretty damn cool place. So there was a revolving door of various Flamin' Groovy members, and they continued making records that didn't really sell until in 1976 when they signed with Sire Records and released Shake Some Action, which would firmly entrench them as godfathers with the exploding punk rock scene. Perhaps San Francisco's most beloved garage rock band ever, the Flamin' Groovies. So we're at the end of Haight Street right here, and I think we'll take a walk through Golden Gate Park to Hippie Hill. The unlikely garage band that would turn out to arguably have the most profound long-term effect on rock and roll was Blue Cheer. When they formed in 1966, their music was classified as psychedelic blues or acid rock, but come on, they were heavy metal. Formed by Dickie Peterson, Lee Stevens, and Paul Wally, they were the first band to turn the knobs up to 11, and in 1968 put out their debut album, Vincebus Eruptum, and their classic rendition of Summertime Blues, and they were unquestionably the loudest band in the world. And I have to say, I think it's both brilliant and hilarious that they named themselves after a particularly potent brand of LSD that was at the time going around Haight Ashbury. They were notorious for their sheer volume and power, and when they made an appearance on the Steve Allen Show, his introduction was simply Blue Cheer, Run for Your Life. And when caught smoking hash before their appearance on American Bandstand, none other than Dick Clark himself told them that they were what gave rock and roll a bad name. High praise indeed, Blue Cheer. So as you can see, we're at Hippie Hill now in Golden Gate Park. Here's the peace sign right here. And that would mean we're at the end of the line. I'd like to thank you for hanging out with us. I love coming up to San Francisco like this and hope to do it again. And if you haven't done it already, I would very much appreciate if you liked and subscribed to the channel. We've got a really cool back catalog. If you like classic rock, I think you'll enjoy it. Again, for Tim, thanks for hanging out with us. Let's be kind to one another. Peace out.